us. Today we're going to be talking about supporting students with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. My name is Megan Halverson. I'm an autism and behavior specialist within 916.
Hi, and I'm Cara McGlynn, the lead school social worker with Northeast Metro 916.
The learning targets that we're going to be exploring today is increasing our understanding of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, exploring the impact of FASD, gaining strategies to support learners that are impacted with FASD, and then identification and resources for continued learning and support.
So, what is FASD? The important piece here to remember is that it is a brain injury. Unlike a lot of things in the mental health world, we talk about diagnoses in the case in which we're able to treat and people heal and restore their more normative developmental trajectory. With FASD, that's not the case. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorders are a group of conditions, and we're going to get more into the nuance there, but we're talking about primarily 4 conditions which occur when the biological mother consumes alcohol when pregnant. Or any sort of substance. Again, we'll get into some of the nuance. These effects can include physical abnormalities, however, not always. And again, we'll get into some of that too. One of the hallmarks, certainly, though, is some behavioral challenges and learning challenges, which as school staff really do impact and impair sometimes our ability to support these learners. So we're going to talk about some positive strategies that you can incorporate into your learning spaces to help not just students on the fetal alcohol spectrum disorder spectrum succeed, but all learners. It's important to know that FASD affects people in really different ways and can range in severity of impact from mild to really severe. That makes this disability in particular really hard for educators to acknowledge and work with because there's no standard presentation of it. And then kind of going along with that, people with FASD exhibit this really wide range of mixed symptoms. So there are lots of myths around fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and we're just gonna hopefully dismantle some of those. The first one is that you can tell someone has FASD by the way they look. That is absolutely not true. The majority of people that actually have FASD don't have physical characteristics of the disability. So in the 1980s, when research started getting really prevalent on FASD, people started this myth that persons with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder have facial features that are congruent with the disorder. And while some people certainly do have those, that is not a hard and fast rule. So by assuming that in order to have FASD, you have to have that, we're actually really limiting the number of people that are likely impacted by fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. The next myth, FASD only affects children and adolescents. Adults don't have it. Well, that is just not true. FASD is a permanent lifelong disability. People do not have the ability to outgrow this. Adults do face greater challenges as they get older because their behavior becomes even less acceptable as adults. So it's really important in our transition programs, especially for us to set up folks with FASD for community-based supports that are going to help with them long after they've left our educational facilities. That goes into that next myth around children grow out of FASD, which again, there is no known cure. And that persons with FASD do require a lifetime of support. The next myth, FASD is just a trendy disability. Oh gosh, in the mental health field, we certainly hear this quite a bit. I've heard that about reactive attachment disorder in my career, bipolar disorder, and that's just not the case. I apologize, I did misspeak earlier. I alluded to research in the 1980s around FASD, but the research really actually started in the 1970s. And the reason FASD in the past 40 years is much more prevalent as a conversation in our community is because for the first time in the 1970s, we were able, as a mental health and health community, to accurately diagnose the disorder. Frequently, it is misdiagnosed, and we will talk about why shortly. But when we look at FASD and its prevalence in developmental delays and its prevalence as far as being misdiagnosed, uh, it's been observed and documented as far back as concerns in like biblical and Greek times. So this is not a new disorder. We're just getting better at naming it, identifying it, and supporting persons with it. The next myth, people with FASD have low IQs. Just like anyone in the population, some people do have low IQs, but not always. And the same as in the FASD. So it's just not a hard and fast rule. And I think it's really important to think about all of this because when we limit ourselves by thinking that people have to meet these hard and fast rules, again, we underdiagnose the prevalence of FASD. So some individuals have average IQ, but experience other cognitive difficulties. Typically, the hallmarks opposed to a lower IQ are going to be around deficits with impulsivity, staying on task, judgment, problem solving, time management. Many students with FASD score higher on IQ tests than is actually representative of their ability to function in the classroom and in real life situations. So it's really important to consider that as well. The next myth, behavior is a choice. People with FASD just need to try harder. No. FASD impacts and impairs people's behavior. Most healthy adults know how to and have the mental capacity to control their own behavior and follow societal norms, but that's just not the case with folks with FASD. Oftentimes, FASD falls into that category of invisible disabilities that affect our behavior and are often underdiagnosed because behavior is so frequently identified or assumed to be a choice. It's really important to take into account that the brain damage associated with FASD often prevents people from being capable of controlling their own behavior. And then the last of our myths, the mothers of children with FASD must be alcoholics. Social drinking wouldn't cause FASD. So this one is super problematic for school staff, especially given the amount of shame and guilt and blame that's laden in that myth. And given that it is our role as a school to partner and collaborate with families. So if we're coming at families with that sort of judgment, that does not encourage any sort of collaboration. And also, that's just not the case. Experts do not know how much alcohol a pregnant woman can safely drink. Experts do know, however, that the more alcohol a pregnant woman consumes, the greater the risk is to the developing fetus. Given that, really, at any point during the pregnancy, even a small portion of alcohol can impact the developing fetus. So depending upon the circumstances, that person could have engaged in social drinking at any point, and it might have impacted an outcome for their child that would have led to fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. So again, just to reiterate, there's no known safe amount of alcohol during pregnancy. And by assuming that this myth is true, really sets us up to fail in a partnering relationship with families. This is just a quote I like from a Canadian researcher. FASD is a person-first disability, as in we need to learn about the person first and then how the disability affects them. So going back to the diagnosis itself, FASD is a mental health and medical diagnosis. It comes from the DSM-5 is the version we're in now. I'm sure there will be a 6 before we can think too much about it. But it's an umbrella term for a range of disorders. And again, when we think about the impairment that these disorders cause, it really goes on the spectrum from super mild to very severe. Uh, this also can cause physical and mental birth defects. So this just breaks down the types of disorders that are included under that umbrella. So fetal alcohol spectrum, fetal alcohol syndrome, or FAS, alcohol-related birth defects, alcohol-related neurodevelopment disorder, and then neurobehavioral disorder associated with prenatal alcohol exposure. That said, oftentimes when we are working with families where the fetus was exposed to other substances, typically we do end up with more of this diagnosis, even though other substances might be impacting that child's brain impairment. This diagnosis is also really, really hard for people in the health and mental health community to diagnose because it comes from the fact that a person, a mother, has to name that she engaged in using alcohol while she was pregnant. And again, if we go back to the last couple of slides, it's typically a really shame-laden disclosure for someone to provide. As I said a little bit earlier, oftentimes FASD is underdiagnosed and masked as another impairment. One of the most frequent impairments that it is confused for is ADHD. And if you see here, there are certainly some shared impairments within both of these disorders and needs. However, persons with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder tend to have far more and significant needs in order to be successful in the learning environment. That said, just because a person has FASD does not mean that they cannot have both FASD and ADHD. Oftentimes, when we think about dual diagnosis in the mental health world, FASD is oftentimes duly diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and major depressive disorder. So we certainly see its prevalence in comorbidity as well. When we think about the prevalence, this just runs down some numbers for you. Again, I think the important pieces here are around the comorbidity. Some research indicates that there's a connection to persons with FASD and histories of complex trauma. And if we think about circumstances in which a pregnant mother might be engaging in alcohol use, it is possible that those are some coping skills that are being used in order to navigate highly stressful situations. It's also possible that children, when born to mothers with FASD, might have a caregiver who is absent due to their own engagement with some sort of addiction, if that is a need that caregiver has. So when children are born to persons with addictions, what happens is that they aren't getting those amazing serve and return responses that are needed in order for them to develop healthy attachment. And that plays into that potential comorbidity with complex trauma. So when we think about working with kids with FASD, just like some of the structural pieces that Megan's going to talk about shortly that are just amazing for all learners, it's also important that we pull in those trauma-informed practice strategies here too. Again, it's not just going to support students with FASD, it's going to support all of our learners in a really impactful way. Okay, so the best way I could think to explain FASD in the brain is through these two visuals here. So if you notice the visual that's labeled A, you'll see that the information is the way the brain develops is from the bottom up, and the information is stored in this really orderly manner. If you look at brain B, that's a representation of potentially a person with FASD. So you'll see that there's undergrowth in certain areas of the brain, overgrowth in others. There's some gaps and some tangles. Typically, brains with FASD show fewer cells, and the brain structure and chemistry tends to be altered, which does impact and affect basic cognitive abilities and sensory responses. So I'm a visual person. This was helpful to me. Hopefully it's helpful to you too. So this just looks at the executive functioning skills that are needed to do school. When we think about executive functioning, that really plays into students' educability. Those are those things that, in order to be successful in the classroom, we want students to come in with this skill set, hopefully in early elementary. They're working on this and developing this. Some of our students come to us with some of these pieces already in place, which is amazing. And when students are functioning with FASD, these areas of executive functioning are going to be impacted and impaired. So this just breaks it down linearly as you look from the left-hand side of the screen to the right-hand side, how the effects of exposure prenatally to alcohol might impair those executive functioning skills. Okay, so this is another concept that when we're thinking about FASD gets a little tricky. Persons with FASD develop different areas of learning at different rates. So what this example is here is potentially one student. So let's say this is one student from 916's Wells North program. So the student has FASD and their physical age is 18 years old. But when we break down their skills, this person might have a developmental age and just the expressive language skill that's more reflective of someone who's 20. But their comprehension might be more reflective of someone who is age 6. And that just goes down the line. And so I think this really highlights that it's unrealistic to expect young adults to leave the home at 18 prepared to take care of themselves. Additional growth and maturity are needed in order to allow persons with FASD to be able to support themselves independently. And it's also important that we keep this in mind because as educators and then the parents and families we work with, we need to support each other in adjusting our expectations based on what the developmental age is and the skills that are being demonstrated, as opposed to the focus on the physical age, which tends to be a traditional education paradigm. Expecting a person with FASD to correct their inappropriate behaviors also can be really frustrating for the caregiver and child. If we're thinking about a person's development and ability, oftentimes, again, a traditional education structure expects people to operate within their physical age. So just be thinking about there's a lot of nuance, again, when we're working with persons with FASD. And the best rule of thumb is to meet them where they're at in their skills with the developmental age that they're showing you. So this is just a breakdown of as we're looking at persons with FASD in primary school and in secondary school, just some good practice information for you to have. Preschoolers with FASD may not immediately grasp the meaning of a word or phrase. It's important that, and Megan will get into this a little bit too, but as we're thinking about differentiation with folks with FASD, visuals are really helpful. Elementary school children with FASD may display attention impairments, learning disabilities, cognitive disabilities, deficits in hierarchically ordering things, concerns with expressive language and poor muscle control. And that continues on to secondary school even with some of the restorative skills that we teach. So certainly it might not be as pronounced by the time a student goes to secondary school. However, some of these will still be a need area. And then again, just highlighting that regardless if a student's in primary school or secondary school, the strategies that the educational staff and families provide can facilitate and support academic achievement. By secondary school, oftentimes students with FASD recognize that they're different from their peers and have a hard time fitting in. And when we think about some of the developmental tasks that are associated with being a teenager, this becomes problematic because that independence that's needed typically comes from those peer relationships in our teenagehood. However, students with FASD do not have those same connections because they feel oftentimes ostracized by their same physical age peer group. So it's important to provide social opportunities in which persons with FASD can practice their social skills appropriately and develop a peer group that's appropriate for them. Social skills are also typically several years behind their other peers. We've talked about that a little bit, but that goes into that struggle with maintaining relationships. And then I think a really important one here too is to think about there's a lot of concerns regarding dropout in high school age students with FASD. So again, the more we can focus on curriculum that directly connects to those outcomes after school, I think it's much more meaningful to persons with FASD because they can see with lots of help and support and constant reminders that there's an end goal in place, and then having those more hands-on experiences tend to lend themselves to their needed learning style. I am not going to read all of this to you, but I am going to freeze this for just a moment on this slide and the next for you to read. We just thought that they really nicely outlined the challenges associated with FASD and how some of those challenges look like operationally. Also, feel free to pause here if you'd like to spend more time with the slide. And as I said earlier, I'm a social worker, so it's really important to my professional discipline and my own personal code of ethics to end on a piece about strengths, because it's so important that we take a strengths-based framework for all learners, but certainly in students with FASD. So there are some common strengths that research shows us pretty universally in these learners. They tend to be artistic, musical, mechanical, athletic, friendly, outgoing, affectionate, willing to help, highly verbal. So I think sometimes that gets a little confusing because verbal skills don't always connect with cognitive processing skills. So just keep that in mind. And then every day is a new day. Because of the way memory is stored in our brain when we have FASD, those short-term memory circuits often get crossed and they forget behavior that happens the day before. It's an amazing gift for us too as educators because we're not always perfect. So we're always able to start the relationship off on a fresh foot. So with that, I will pass it over to Megan.
Thank you, Cara. Now we're going to talk about some strategies that we can use to support learners that are impacted by FASD. The National Organization of Fetal Alcohol Syndrome identified these 5 things. Structure. We want to create predictability in our environment through the use of environmental modifications, schedules, and routines. Consistency. It's important to have consistent procedures and responses. Variety. Teaching with variety allows us to tap into different learning styles and helps to increase motivation. Brevity. We want to use precise and exact words. This helps to create a clear message for our students. Persistence. We want to support students to increase their ability to complete tasks. Now we are going to explore these areas in a little bit more detail. Why structure? We want to enable students to function as meaningfully and independently as possible. We are not going to be there to support our students at home or in the community at all times. So we want to teach them these skills to be successful and independent when we're not there. By working to create clarity and predictability, we are teaching students what is expected. We want students to develop functional routines and strategies that can be used in various contexts and with different people. These are important skills that our students need in order to build independence and self-sufficiency. When thinking about structure, we're going to talk about a couple different areas. The first one is physical structure. This refers to the way the furniture and the materials are arranged and organized. Thinking about desks, the way the chairs are, where they're positioned, if there's where the bulletin board is or the whiteboard, what does their space look like? We want to use physical structure to add meaning and context to each area. This helps students navigate the environment with greater independence. Individual visuals and schedules. It is not only important for our students to have visuals and schedules, but it's crucial that they know how to use them. Teach this early, so we want to start as early as possible. Visual cues provide students with a systematic strategy that they can use to put pieces together into correct sequences. Routines and strategies. When we teach and use predictable routines, we are supporting our students by decreasing confusion. Structured routines and strategies increase independence. It allows students to learn flexibility within a work system. I am now going to walk you through each area and provide you with some visual examples. Physical structure is the information being given to our students by the environment. We want to modify the environment in order to increase independence. We want students to know what to expect, which will decrease confusion. This in turn helps students to increase flexibility. While most systems will remain consistent, the activities within those systems may change. We are teaching students flexibility within that defined context. When students understand what is expected, behaviors will decrease. Here's some examples of visually defined and structured spaces. You can see by the FASD location that when students walk in, they will know where to sit because there's blue spaces that are already defined for them. There's different workspaces that you can see. You're going to be facing towards the computer. That's where the desk is situated. There's schedules. These areas are clear of clutter. You can highlight the main information that the student's needing to pick out. It's important to consider environmental modifications. We want to be using calm colors and reducing the brightness in our classrooms. Many people show sensitivities to bright lights and colors. We want to make sure that we're seating the student in a space to minimize distractions. Be mindful of seating students next to the classroom door or the hallway by objects that make noise. We want to make sure we're keeping seating consistent. We want to create predictability. Remove unnecessary distractions. Consider bulletin boards, things hung up on the walls or the ceilings, unneeded materials. We want students to key in to what's important. Provide break spaces and structure the activities within that space. We want to teach students how to take breaks. Make sure to practice these activities frequently, so when they are dysregulated, they can pull upon what they've previously learned, and you can support that by visual supports. Be mindful of traffic patterns. Again, we want to eliminate any unneeded distractions. Define student spaces. We want to provide clarity, organization, and structure. Be mindful of neighboring students. We all know those students that like to make noise. We want to make sure that our student is not seated right next to that student. Another thing to consider is any extraneous noise. Consult with your OT. There's a number of tools that we can use to support students, like headphones. Here's an example of some different, of why visuals are important. I like this one. Visuals are permanent. Spoken words tend to disappear. Again, we're not always going to be with our students. If they're able to pull upon one of their visuals to help jog their memory or to help with a routine, we're creating independence for them. Visuals allow time for language processing. We need to know our learner and know how long it does take them to process information. Visuals prepare students for transitions. You can use a first then, an object schedule, a longer schedule. But it's a great way to support those students that show difficulty in that area. Visuals help kids see what you mean. Again, we're tapping into the different learning styles that our kids have. Visuals help all students. And I would go as far to say as visuals help everyone. I use visuals with my students or with my children's sports. I use a visual calendar for directions and for where I need to go for meetings. Everybody uses visuals. Visuals help build independence. Again, it's not you standing over the student saying, what's next? Or where do you need to be? It's prompting them to check their schedule, which hopefully will be something that they can then do without that verbal prompt. Visuals are transferable between environments and people. If I have something that's working out really well in the classroom, I'm going to make sure I send that home so parents can use it. Visuals have no attitude, no tone, no frustration, and no disapproval. And visuals help reduce anxiety. It helps to reduce anxiety because it's giving you the student predictability. Here's some examples of a number of different visual supports. On the top left, you'll see a high school student's locker, and everything is color-coded and then labeled. So the student would know what class or what they need to bring to each of the classes or what they need to bring home. Below, you'll see it's a green, yellow, and red box. That's a turn-in box. The green is, I get it. I understand all the concepts. The yellow box is, I'm getting there, so maybe they don't understand all the concepts that were discussed on that page, but they're almost there. And then the red one is a signal that I need help. I need someone to really go over this with me again. This can be a support in any classroom and for any student. Then you'll see an example of a visual schedule of how to wipe down a table. So it's breaking each of the tasks down into simple, manageable steps that students can do. This is great for those that are in a transition program or those students at lunch that are struggling to follow through with various steps. Below that, you will see a wallet, and it's labeled with each of the things that the student needs to save for. So it's helping that student keep track of their money and their resources. Above there, you'll see just an example of how to label things in the classroom. So a lot of times we have these little things that are all strewn around the classroom. Providing some kind of structure with materials is going to help everybody out. To the right of that, you'll see an organizer. So that's something that we could put together for a student. And when they transition to various classes, they have all the materials that they need within that simple construct. Below that, you'll see an example of a schedule. And it's broken up into work activities, calendar, important dates, things to remember. We want to teach students how to use these supports when they're young. So when they're older, they're not needing to rush to learn it. It's already going to be a system in place. We may need to tweak it a little bit depending upon, their age, but it's something that once they get that framework, they're going to have it. Above is some keys that are labeled. I need this because I'm always fumbling for what key I need to use for different doors. But this is another example of how you can just structure and provide some support around simple items. Below that, you'll see a clock, and it's used for time management. We always have those kids that are like, how much time do we have to do this? Or how long do I have to finish this activity? This is a great support that you can use to help structure the day. And then below is a campus map. And it's just an example that, again, we all use visual supports. They're going to change depending upon what our needs are, but they're always going to be needed. So we really need to tap in and teach these students how to use it now. Schedules. Again, this is such an important thing. We all use schedules. Schedules tell us where we're going and what to expect. It's an important life skill, so we really need to teach it. Many educators are great at providing a schedule to a student. However, we need to take that one step further. We need to make sure that they know how to use it. Teaching students to reference it independently throughout the day is going to be extremely important. It's not that they're always going to need it, but it's going to be there on those days that they do need it. Once that skill is mastered, we can work towards the student developing their own schedule. Again, everyone uses schedules. Creating this routine will help to support their independence. Next, you'll see some examples of just various schedules. There's a first, then. You could take it a step further to the right of that. You'll see a first, then, next, last. So when you have a student that's able to master that first, then, or that first, then, next, you can, break it up a little bit. Below that, you'll see a typical classroom schedule. So it really points out what's the homework? What are we going to work on today? And then it breaks apart the weekly assignments and agenda. To the right of that, you'll see a visual schedule. So that's something that the student would start at the top and then move down and pull as they move throughout their day. The pics will be collected in that little blue envelope below. So that's another schedule that you can use if that's helping your student at that level. To the right of that is another example of a visual schedule. There they have the student's picture on the bottom one. The rest of them, they have just the student's name. So it's really knowing your student and knowing what supports that they'll need. Above is just an agenda book. So again, all people use schedules. In my son's school, this is something that all sixth graders use. I think 3rd through 6th use an agenda. So they're teaching this in the mainstream. We want to make sure that we're teaching this skill to all of our students. Some students need an object-based schedule. They need something that they can feel and explore to help them understand what's expected. To the right is just, something that I use all the time. It's just my phone and the calendar that's within that. Below, you'll see another schedule that's color-coded. And then below that, you'll see a visual schedule of a morning routine. So brushing my hair, putting on deodorant, washing my hands, brushing my teeth, washing my face, shaving my face. Schedules are so important, and I think they're often not used as much as we need to be using them and teaching to them. Another thing that we really want to focus on is teaching routines. We want to teach students how to enter and leave the classroom, how to take a restroom and water break, how to pass other students in the hallway, or how to walk in the hallway with their hands down and their voices off, how to get supplies or sharpen a pencil, what to do if there's a substitute. That's often a really stressful thing for kids. Cleaning and organizing materials, setting up for this each day, how to seek help in the classroom and around the building, what's expected at lunch, what's that routine look like, how do I get my tray, where do I sit, where's my spot, what do I do when lunch is over, a routine for recess, what do I do if someone's on the swing that I want, or if someone's playing basketball and I want to join, what's a routine for that? Talking about downtime, that's often a time of chaos for students. So what to do when we don't have something that's structured. Providing activities within that is going to be helpful. How to turn in work, how to gather supplies and materials to bring home. Setting up and teaching routines whenever you see lagging skills is crucial. If I'm continually prompting students with the same direction on a daily basis, that's a pretty big red flag that I need to teach a routine around that. This increases independence while decreasing me needing to prompt students. We really want to focus on supporting communication. So as you can see, there's 3 different ways that we broke that up. It's receptive when giving directions, and expressive language. When looking at receptive language, we want to make sure that we're gaining the students' attention before speaking or giving them directions. This is crucial. We want to be concise and concrete. This is where that brevity we spoke about earlier comes in. We want to be using consistent language. This helps to jog the memory while providing a consistent message to all students. We want to make sure that we're monitoring our rate of speech. Remember, some students need additional time to process that verbal information. And teach, be explicit with body language, tone, nonverbal cues, and our voice volume. Interpreting nonverbal cues is often difficult for many students. When giving directions, we want to make sure that we're only giving one direction at a time. And then we want to make sure that we're waiting for that understanding. Use demonstration, visuals, and cues whenever possible. We want to be tapping into that student's learning style. Use models for end products when possible. This helps your students see what's expected. Allow time for processing. And again, this will vary per student. I always try to collect a little baseline data and see like, how long does it take this student to process information, verbal or visual? And then I always think to myself, you got to wait until it feels awkward, because it may not feel awkward for that student, but it's giving them that needed time to process information. Gain feedback and check for understanding. This is a crucial part of the learning process for everyone. When we're looking at expressive language, instead of correcting speech, we want to make sure that we're modeling it. Modeling can help facilitate development and progress of language. Recognize and honor communication attempts. This is a key thing, and it contributes to motivation. Utilize visual cues and communication systems. We want to provide the students with the voice that they need. We could use core boards, social scripts, pictures. If they use a device, we want to make sure that they have that with them at all times. Allow for flexibility of expression. Draw, they could be typing, voice to text. Learners differ in the way that they can navigate in a learning environment, and we want to provide them with the tools that they need to be able to express themselves. You can utilize a memory wall, a folder, a book. They can take that with them anywhere, and they can pull upon that needed knowledge anywhere they're at without you being there. All right, we're taking a look at behavior. Again, fetal alcohol spectrum is a neurological disability. These kids are not trying to be bad. Common lagging skills are a result of brain damage that occurred before birth. Behaviors being exhibited are not a choice. These behaviors occur across all populations, races, socioeconomic backgrounds. This includes those with average IQs, as Kara spoke about earlier. Despite areas of difficulty, it's important to remember that everyone has areas of strength. We want to connect our students' experiences through instructional planning and delivery. We want to make sure that we're fostering strengths throughout by using predictable routines and structured learning experiences. We can support this by developing strong family and community partnerships. I'm a big, huge Ross Greene fan, so some of this is pulled from his work. Some of the common lagging skills that we see are difficulty with learning, attention, and memory. This can cause frustration and may be difficult for these kiddos to communicate. When students cannot communicate their frustration, we will often see those maladaptive behaviors. We want to remember that behavior is communication. So we need to try to figure out what these students are trying to communicate to us. You'll often see a hypersensitive sensory system. This may cause an overreaction to sounds, lights, and touch. When senses are flooded with information, processing can be difficult, and students may react with anger and aggression. A student's sensory need should always be a key consideration when thinking about programming and how they are navigating their environment. Difficulties with transition can cause students become upset when changes occur. It's important to think about transitions not only from location to location, but also from activity to activity. This is where those visual supports come in handy. We want students to, understand what's expected. So we want to be providing them with the supports that they need to have clarity around that. Students may act before thinking and seem confused by the consequences of their actions. Sometimes this confusion is described as a lack of judgment or failure to learn from mistakes. When the behavior is misunderstood repeatedly, these kiddos feel a sense of failure and defeat, which is, not what we want them to be feeling. These behavioral characteristics can make students with FASD more vulnerable to the negative influences of others, especially when they are not fully understanding the misbehavior in the first place. We need to make sure that we're changing our lens. As educators, we need to remember that these students are not manipulating or disobeying deliberately in the classroom. They often don't understand what's being expected of them. They have a difficult time understanding that cause and effect, impulsivity, difficulties generalizing, and understanding abstract concepts. This makes understanding their behavior even more difficult. Research shows that a reward and punishment system rarely works for these kiddos. This is due to the students not fully understanding that misbehavior in the first place. To the right, you will see a table of various maladaptive behaviors. You will then notice common misinterpretations as well as how this behavior should be interpreted. When we focus on teaching to the skill, we are operating under the notion that kids will do well if they can. And so I'm not going to read through all these, but again, if you just want to kind of pause your screen and look through them, I think they're pretty helpful. When looking at interventions, we're going to explore some traditional interventions and why they just will not work with this population of students. Consequences must be heard and understood. Consequences may be associated with the behavior. The meaning of consequences can be integrated with future behavior. Understand that different behavior will result in a different outcome. Typically, people can generalize this information and apply it to other circumstances. And they can recall the consequences of past behavior and understand the error of their choices. This won't work because our students exhibit difficulties retrieving previously stored information. They struggle to make connections in that association. They demonstrate difficulties with comparing and contrasting problems. This is an important skill needed to understand how our behavior impacts others. Difficulties with generalizing is hard when students are not applying what they learned across context. I may have learned a situation at school, but I'm not understanding that, again, I can't do that at home, or I can't do that in the community. They exhibited difficulty understanding that a future behavior will have the same outcome. They may struggle to see similarities and differences, their behavior and through the behavior of others. Often they struggle to interpret social situations. Impacted with that could be sensory difficulties. So there's lots of things that they're really struggling with that we need to take in consideration when we're looking at these interventions. We need to change our lens. So recognizing that our students are trying hard is key. We need to foster that learning environment. So this mind shift, that growth mindset, includes the following ideas. This child can't right now, instead of this child won't. We need to recognize that some disabilities are invisible. This thinks strengths, not problems. We want to be using a strength-based approach at all times with our kiddos. Use bridges and supports to help students reach goals. This is where those accommodations and visual supports come into play. We want our students to gain independence, and we need to give them the tools that they need to be able to navigate all those different various dynamics and social situations. It's crucial to team with families. They know their student best. We want to make sure to get to know what supports are going to be helpful for them. It's key to take that family-centered approach with these students. We want to use tools to identify learning styles and abilities. And that way we can tailor our teaching to the way that our student learns best. Remember, you have the skills to support your students. Creativity and flexibility of thought will be needed to plan and support for them. When looking at discipline, I love this one. The best discipline is to keep the person from ever needing that discipline. Remember, if a strategy is not working based on that data that you're taking, don't try harder. It's up to us to change what we're doing. We want to make sure that we're being consistent and using techniques that we're able to follow through with. I don't want to be making any promises that I can't follow through with. If consequences are needed, they need to be immediate and not delayed. So that's not as the students walking out to the bus and saying, remember tomorrow you lost your privilege on the computer. That's going to be setting the student up for failure. Review rules and consequences frequently. Make them visual. Put them in a book or a binder so they can be referenced whenever the student needs, a reminder of what they are. We want to make sure that we're not debating rules or consequences. We want to avoid power struggles. Nobody wins when we're engaged in power struggles. We want to make sure that we're closely monitoring activities in unstructured time. Again, those unstructured times is when most of that chaos ensues. Avoid threats in lecture. This rarely works for anyone. And then it's super important to anticipate. We want to make sure that we're recognizing those signs early so we can intervene. That's going to be key to making sure that our students are successful. And please pre-teach calming strategies and have supports in place. We want to make sure that we're practicing when that student is regulated. That way that the students can utilize the supports when needed. When we practice when students are regulated, they're able to get that material in a little easier. But when we're already up here, that's not when learning happens. So we want to practice frequently when our students are in that good space. Next, you will see a ton of online resources. So if you're like, hey, I want to learn more about this, or what are some supports that I can tap into? Cara and I put together a ton of different resources for continued learning and support that you can access. And then here are the references that we use. So again, if you're a data person, jump into some of those because there's some interesting information in there. Thank you so much for taking the time to learn with us today. We appreciate you being here, and we hope that you found this information to be valuable. Again, thank you.